that is something that can support every single state. Grid stability is super important. Sometimes I wonder, how much do we overstate things as a group of Bitcoins, because it feels like a positive for Bitcoin. So do we overstate it? You will know better than me. Like how credible are claims that Bitcoin mining can make a grid stronger, and how much did they touch on that in the report?
Yeah, they mentioned it. They didn't give it a long treatment. I mean, I'm one of the main kind of proponents of this claim, so I'm partially responsible for the sort of now widespread view within Bitcoin that miners can play this grid stabilization role. It's a complex topic. Demand response is not that well understood, even in the energy sector, and trying to explain it to a layperson is also challenging. So it also very much depends on the ISO or RTO. So basically the subunit. There's not just one grid in America. There's a whole bunch of geographic regions, and they all have different policies and also different jargon, different nomenclature. The one that I spend a lot of time on is Texas because it's very special and unique, and it's islanded, which means it's not really connected to the rest of the American grid. And it also has a lot of renewables. Like the Texas grid has probably more renewables overall than maybe any other major one, aside from possibly California.
Kind of ironic, really.
Well, it's just blessed with wind and solar. Yeah, so you might say, well, Texas is this ruby red state. Why do they have so many renewables? Well, there's big federal credits for building wind and solar, and it happens to be the best place in North America to have both wind and solar. So if you think about the map of where it's windy in America, it's mostly west. It's mostly sort of west of the Mississippi. And if you think about where it's sunny, it's the Southwest. So West Texas is very abundant in terms of wind and energy, wind and solar. So you got tons and tons of wind and solar built there. They also built out this big transmission line called CREZ, which basically all this renewable generation popped up along the line. It's like when back in the old days you'd build a railroad and people would build cities next to the railroad. It's like that. And so they have some enormous percentage of their grid, which is wind and solar. And so and that meant that there were negative prices a lot. Or zero prices, because they couldn't really get all of that generation to the parts of Texas where people are consuming energy. Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, more in the sort of southeast part of the state. And so you do have, and when you have wind and solar, they're sort of more intermittent, right? You're dependent on the weather. And so it is useful to have industrial consumers of energy being able to dial down their energy at a moment's notice. And Bitcoin miners are very suited for this, more so than I would say any other industrial consumer, because they're fully interruptible. They can interrupt their whole process at a moment's notice without really suffering any significant losses aside from just the opportunity cost. They can dial down their entire consumption, not just partial. If you think about an aluminum plant, they can dial down a portion of their generation, but it takes time. They need notice, and it takes time to get it back online too. If you think about other industrial consumers of energy, think about a hospital. They can't dial down their consumption. People would die. An office building, they can't just turn off the AC. People would complain, right? So Bitcoin miners are very good at this. The report kind of dismisses it, though, because they say the Bitcoin miners are the ones responsible for higher load anyway. And so by modulating their load when there's a grid scarcity, they're not being that helpful, because they accuse Bitcoin miners of sort of causing the grid scarcity in the first place. So they are very dismissive of this grid stabilization. I would say Bitcoin miners, they are able to produce kind of unique, and Sean Connell would be the guy who I think is the best at this. I'm certainly not an expert on energy. They're able to sort of uniquely create these products, like in Texas, they call them like ancillary services, where they can be highly configurable, and the grid operator can almost like take control of the miner and their energy consumption and modulate it in real time to meet the grid objectives. But you're right. I mean, we can't overstate it. I would say it's useful, and I hope that miners provide more clarity around the extent to which they're doing this. They also get compensated for it. So when miners are voluntarily, curtailing their usage, they opt into these sort of programs, and the grid operator says, "Hey, I need you to turn off your equipment for 2 hours." They do get paid for that. So it's like they're selling insurance to the grid. And that's another thing that people complain about. It's like, how dare they get paid when there's a grid scarcity event? Well, it's because it makes sense economically to pay them to turn off so that everybody else can benefit. So these are formal programs. They are set up by the grid operators themselves. Miners are very good at taking advantage of them. They're very suited to do that. That's a good feature. We need more flexibility in the grid as we have more wind and solar, for sure.